My name is Ellen Holste. I'm the Community Program Manager at Cedar Creek Institute. I want to welcome you guys this morning to our last virtual coffee talk of the summer. These have been kind of fun. I've learned a lot this summer. Hopefully you guys have as well. I'm going to quickly share my screen for a second. Just to let you guys know a few things about the platform we're using, as well as what's some things coming up. So as I said, this is our virtual coffee talk this morning, The Powerful Nature of Words with Professor Kalisz. She's from Grand Rapids Community College, and she was one of our mentors this summer for one of our students that was out of the Institute this summer. But now I get the pleasure of introducing our speaker this morning. I'm so excited about this. Our speaker this morning, as I mentioned, is Professor Kalisz. She's from Grand Rapids Community College. And before I hand it off to her, I did have a question for her. My question was, did you always know you wanted to be a writer?
Thanks, Ellen. That's a good question. I think a lot of people assume that writers start writing when they're 5, or in the movies that there's a lot of tropes that are just not true. But no, I did not know I wanted to be a writer. Not until probably later, even after I finished. I've always taught English, but it wasn't until I was in my teaching career that I really started to write regularly, and especially to get into poetry. So it's not something that you're either born doing or not. And I hope that through the presentation today, you'll be encouraged to kind of see yourselves as writers too, even if maybe you don't think of yourself as one right now. So, okay.
All right.
Let's see. I think I can share my screen right now. Is that right? Yeah.
Correct.
Okay. All right. So there's the title slide. Don't need to see that. Like you said, that's my name. My contact information, if you want to get a hold of me or follow up or anything like that, I'm happy to continue our conversation after this. I teach at GRCC, and I teach there the first year composition classes, so English 101 and 102, and I also teach creative writing. And my website here has some samples of my work. I'm sharing a few of those through the presentation today, but that is where you can find kind of more information about readings and things like that. And like you said, I had the privilege of being a faculty mentor to a student of mine, Ella, while she worked at PCCI this summer with the Nature in Words Fellowship. And I was introduced to Cedar Creek by one of my colleagues, Marianne Lessert. And I have spent time there writing and with her and hiking and writing, and it's been a place that's become really dear to my heart. So it was really fun to be able to share it with a student of mine this summer. And she actually is just finishing up a chapbook of poetry and paintings called Homebody. So I think that the Institute will probably collect those projects and share them somehow. But that's something to look forward to. There's some really great pieces in there. That's my contact info. All right. So I'm hoping today to talk with you about kind of 3 things when I think about writing, sort of three tips or 3 tricks. And if you have any questions as I'm talking, please feel free to put it in the chat, or you can, I think you can unmute yourself. I'm fine. It's a pretty small group, so I'm fine with being interrupted anytime. So first of all, we're going to talk about images. Then we're going to talk about a fancy term, but it's really pretty basic. It's called literary archetypes. And then we'll talk about white space and line breaks. All right. And then I'm hoping that you will try some writing at the end. I have some prompts for you. So somebody famous and really wise, I don't know exactly who this was, I should look it up, but they said the worst place for a poem to begin from is an idea. And I think that is so true. Poems have to start with an image. And so I think a lot about being a writer, and this is true of all writing, not just poetry, is to pay attention and to notice images that are striking to you and to keep track of those. So I had a professor once that said it's an abiding image, something that you have to sort of follow, and something that stays with you. So that's kind of the first part here that I want to talk about. One of the things that let's see here, I'm trying to move my little menu because it's in my way. There we go. One of the things I usually tell my students is think about what stops you in your tracks. And that sounds really extreme. And at first, a lot of them are like, I don't think anything does, right? And that's because we have to hone our attention. So good writers are just really good at paying attention to what's around them. There should be like 10 or 12 things every day that stop us in our tracks. If we look around, they're all over the place, you know, especially in nature, but in other places too. And I think that, you know, when you think about images and when you think about working with a starting point for a piece of writing, it's about paying attention, okay? So I thought this picture was funny because it's literally out of place. It doesn't have to be this. I'm not saying you have to find or notice things like this crazy picture. I'm looking out my window right now and just there's an overgrown hibiscus bush or plant, and just the color of the red flowers against the dark green of the forest behind it is, you know, I've never noticed that before, but that the contrast is really interesting. So I encourage you to keep lists and start honing your attention, your focus. I usually start my semesters with my creative writing students by saying, keep track of 10 things every day that stop you in your tracks. And it's really shocking to start, you start to notice more. There are two poems that I think illustrate this really well. The idea of an image and a poet kind of like holding your attention on an image, okay? So this one you might be familiar with. It's often anthologized. It's a real classic. It's by William Carlos Williams, and it's called The Red Wheelbarrow, and you can see it's really short. Some students, some people hate this poem because they're like, how is that even a poem? But I would encourage you to even close your eyes and listen to this because it's so imagistic. You can see it immediately in your mind. So I'm going to read it to you. The Red Wheelbarrow. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater beside the white chicken. It's such a visual poem, right? You can see there's a lot more to talk about here that we probably will not do right now because I just want you to notice how it's clear imagery, right? Again, here there's a contrast, a red wheelbarrow, white chicken, so we have red and white, and the idea of this glaze, the wheelbarrow is glazed with rainwater, so there's some kind of sheen on it, right? The poem is simply focused on an image, right? And that's where we're existing. Okay, this one is a little different. This is a poem that simply lists images, okay? And it's called Mosul. Mosul is a city in Iraq. So this is, as we will soon see, a poem that is focusing our attention on images in this, this town, okay? And again, notice the level of detail in these images, in this list here, and how our attention, the reader's attention is just captivated just by showing us. It's not an idea, it's not making this overt statement about something, it's showing us, sort of witnessing, and that's the power of an image in a poem. Okay, Mosul. The donkey pulling the cart, the caravan of dust, the cart made of plywood, of crossbeam and junkyard tires. The donkey made of donkey. The long face, the long ears, the curled lashes, the obsidian eyes blinking in the dust. The cart rolling, cracking the knuckles of pebbles. The dust. The blanket over the cart, the hidden mortar shells, the veins of wires, the remote device, the red light, the donkey trotting, the blue sky, the rolling cart, the dust smudging the blue sky, the silent bell of the sun, the Humvee, the soldiers, the dust-colored uniforms, the boy from Montgomery, the boy from Little Falls, the donkey cart approaching, the dust, the laughter on their lips, the dust on their lips, the moment before the moment, the shockwave, the dust, the dust, the dust. So a really powerful poem, created entirely by images, right? And where they're placed here. And also, I'm sure you notice the repetition, right? So I think this is one of my, my poems that's sort of in process here. But I started with sort of 3 images. So a Petoskey stone, poison ivy on a hill, and smoke coming out of like a wood stove or a wood boiler. So, and then I kind of compared that to some other things that were going on in the neighborhood and in the world. But again, the idea is it starts with images, okay? I don't see any questions right now before I move to the next section. Okay. This is another one of mine that was from May, and let me see, how am I doing on time, Ellen? Okay.
You are perfectly fine.
Okay, I'll read. I don't know if you can see the very end line here, but I'll read this. This is just a collection of things I noticed this May. I was working on a project for a fundraiser for a press, and it's. I think when you collect images, they can start to sort of like come into groups. And this one, you can see it's called What Rises, and this was everything that I had kept track of that was rising in May. Okay, so I put it into a poem, and it's mostly images. The sun ever earlier and earlier, a bluebird's orange belly to the feeder, a robin beak with a worm, spikes of iris, a heron from the mist off the river. Flags on mailboxes up and down the street, seen from our pot of oatmeal, the May wood pile with ash and cottonwood, wealth of poison ivy on my ankle, muscari in the lawn and dandelions, rhubarb stalks, purple heads of asparagus. So I won't read you the whole poem, but you can see how this starts to characterize May, spring, things that were going on, right? You can see my family gets poison ivy a lot, so my apologies.
Feel free to read the rest because we can't read the actual last line there.
Oh, okay. I can read the rest. Sure. Let's see. I think I stopped here. A second chicken coop. The neighbors erect and paint blue. Theodore the chipmunk for the deck railing for orange peels and apple cores. The dog's rear end in a yoga pose. My rear end in a yoga pose. My son into a Norway spruce. The river to meet the bank. Masks to overtake faces. The death toll. And at last, the white moon surrendering. Surrendering the last time. Okay. Again, images. So there's not an idea. I think I always tell students, trust the images. So the images will lead you, and those sort of represent the ideas. So a lot of I think new writers overwrite poems and explain the images. But in poetry, we really try to trust the images to speak for us and the organization of those images. Okay. The next thing I thought we could talk a little bit about, and that I think it's fun to experiment with, is this idea called literary archetypes here. And that's just a fancy word for what, or phrase for what a lot of you already know, because we just learned this. It's the idea of associations. So there are a whole group of images, lots of images, that have sort of a universal resonance. Okay, and it's almost like activating them when you use them in poetry or writing. So the classic example here is this line: "It was a dark and stormy night." If you hear that, you're not expecting it to be like a love story, right? You have an expectation of it's going to be like a campfire spooky story or something. That's a literary archetype. Okay, and really interesting here is how nature and the cycle of seasons become literary archetypes. So you can see, this little cycle here. we know this, you know this by heart, right? Like spring is when all the animals have their little babies, right? And or are mating and you know, getting ready for that. So spring is often associated with dawn, with the new day beginning, and with youth. Okay, summer with noon and adulthood, fall with sunset and old age, and winter with night and death. So images within one of these seasons um, also sort of have the resonance of something larger beyond just the image itself. Okay, I usually tell students it's kind of like when you use an image of winter, even if you're not writing about death or night, there's an undertone of that. There's a sort of a darkness there. Okay, and you can either work with that as a writer, or you can use it as a contrast. It's not. It doesn't mean that when you use a winter image, your poem has to be about death. Okay, that's not what I'm saying. But you can sort of think about how that contrast might be useful to you as a writer, or how it might complicate what you're writing about. So it's kind of like when you use an image from one of these things, it's kind of like plucking a guitar string. There's an echo, or it reverberates. And there's a whole host of other ones that are not related to the seasons. I did put together a slide here for you with some examples. Okay, and again, a lot of these might seem familiar to you. So for example, you know, a garden or park is a type of paradise, right? There's some biblical things that have that. A meal or a feast as a symbol of harmony and union. A forest as something naturally beautiful or scary. The idea of being lost in the forest is something you know, think of Hansel and Gretel, and like all these. There's lots of echoes of stories and images that that are associated with these, right? That form the basis or the foundation of these archetypes. I think the river one is really interesting. Same with desert or wilderness. Okay, and it doesn't mean I want to be clear. I'm not suggesting that this has to, you know, when you use a desert image, it has to mean barrenness or emptiness. It's just, as a writer, you want to sort of be aware of there's a backdrop here, and so you're bringing sort of that whole host or suitcase of memories or universal images with that into your piece, and you can work with that, or you can sort of choose to work against that. All right.
Katie, when you work against these archetypes, is it harder to do that since there is an expectation? Do you have to work, I guess, work a little bit harder to go against it, or?
That's a good question. Often one of the prompt I have later is asking you to try one of these out, or even to look at a piece that you've already written and to see, are there any archetypes there that you were not aware of? And to see what is it doing in the piece. And sometimes I think that's even more helpful, because if you start thinking about, okay, I'm going to have an image, and then I'm going to have an archetype, and I think the poem gets too heavy-handed. So if you trust the poem's image and kind of think about it, often that kind of comes as it will. I mean, if I go back, for example, to this poem, right? So these are all images. I told you this was written in May. These are all images really then of spring, right? However, I don't know that this is exactly the most hopeful poem, right? And so I wasn't trying to work against this, but it has this overlay of this contrast, right? Because it was also written during a pandemic. So the death toll is rising, even though it's spring. And you know, there's the last word of the poem is surrendering, right? So so it can work both ways. I think it kind of depends on what you want to do. I wouldn't say it's necessarily harder. I think it's harder to be aware of it and kind of notice, like, is this working for the poem or not, right? So one of the things I might consider with this one is, would this poem be better if it had winter imagery? And I would probably say, I don't know. Right now, I think the contrast actually is more true to the reality I was trying to. It was a really confusing time in May. It was really right. Like everybody wants to get out and do everything. In some ways, it would have felt better if all that happened during winter, kind of in a weird way. So anyway, I don't know if I answered your question, Ellen, but
that was perfect.
okay. All right. So literary archetypes. The next thing I wanted to, the last thing I wanted to talk about with you. Don't you love this picture? I think this is so cool. I stole this from this article here with an example, but is the idea of line breaks and white space. Okay, so obviously line breaks are kind of like one of the defining characteristics of poems from prose. You actually break a line in the middle or wherever you want to. You don't just wait until it falls to the next line, right? Like you do when you're typing paragraphs. So engineering this is something that poets have to practice and have to experiment with. And it's not something that's just random. So that brings up the idea of like, how do you do it and why do you do it at certain places? A line break actually is white space. So for example, this here, right? I could have put breaks up here and why, but instead this is a line break because I moved it down here. But this here is also white space. So there's white space when you break a line. There's also white space between the stanzas, or some people call these paragraphs, right? And all of that can represent different things. There's reasons for it, okay? So some of those reasons are sometimes that white space stands for silence or pausing. Some writers use it for punctuation. Some poems use it for punctuation. Sometimes visual impact. It's just, we all know that it's more motivating. When you see a lot of white space, you think, and I love to read and everything, but I think, oh, I can get through that real easy, right? It's easy to read, and that's motivating to a reader. That's not a bad thing. And also white space is sort of where the imagination can come in. That's why I think I love this picture so well, because the white space often hides a lot and invites you into it, okay, to see what else is beyond there. So I think a couple fun examples to showcase this. I think that's where I got this one. This article, I just thought it had an easy example for us to look at. This here is identical in words to this here, okay? But it's changed with the line breaks, okay? And you can see if I read this to you, it's just really clipped. It rhymes. It's like it's expected where the lines break. It's predictable, right? Whereas down here, it's quite different, and it creates a different meaning because there's white space that's allowed to bubble up, right? So here it says, the sky turned black as thunder cracked, trees wreathed and heaved a breath, the wind possessed with howling ghosts, their moans foretelling death. That sounds very traditional, right? 4-line stanzas. Okay, we have some images. We look down here, again, it's the exact same words, right? But notice where the line breaks, right? So here, instead of as thunder cracked, we have as thunder cracked trees. It's almost like the thunder is splitting open trees, right? It gives a different sense of how powerful the thunder is because of how this line is structured. Because trees is on the same plane as this other phrase, right? Wreathed and heaved, and then here's another change, right? A breath. Trees wreathed and heaved a breath. Here we have a breath, the wind, possessed with howling. So it's almost like personifying the wind here, right? The wind becomes a person. We can still read it the same. Trees wreathed and heaved, a breath, the wind, possessed with howling. But the emphasis, the spaces, the way that the words are grouped together now on one line instead of the way they were here, gives us multiple ways to read the poem, right? And it sort of creates more texture in the poem. Also, their moans foretelling death. Spacing it out like this, breaking the line, makes it more dramatic. It slows it down quite a bit, and it makes it seem scarier, right? Their moans. Now, I know we don't read it like this, but I want you to understand that their moans, and then I have all of this line here to think about. Oh gosh, whose moans? What are we talking about? And then foretelling, right? And again, we have this whole line. Oh God, foretelling what? What are we talking about, right? So there's this, that's subconscious, right? I'm not saying that that's how, I know that it's just a line. I'm not freaking out here, but that's the subconscious effect of white space and line breaks, right? All right, so couple examples here. This is one of mine about making syrup. And I wanted to just show you, this is a pretty short poem, but again, I wanted to show you how the line spacing frees up some room in the poem, and the way it's put on the page starts to mirror what the meaning of the poem is, okay? So if you've ever tried to make maple syrup, I did this as a child, and we got so much sap, and then you're like, we're gonna have syrup for years, right? And you boil it, and there's like this much left, and I was so disappointed. So I want to make sure we give you time to write, so I'm not going to read this poem to you, but I want you to just notice how the poem ends on one word, right? All that was left, and the space. I was trying to get the space to echo how it just evaporates. It just goes not into syrup, like into syrup, but there was what happened to all the other stuff that I thought was going to be syrup. Okay. And I think I have another, yeah. This is another one, and I'll read this poem to you, but I want you to think about how the spacing here is meant to sort of emphasize the sort of the loneliness or the missing connection in the poem. All right. If this was just without any spacing, the poem would be tighter, and I don't think that the story of the poem would be as emphasized, which is two people in the poem kind of like crossing paths and never really like having time to connect. All right, it's called Passersby. They trade keys and cars where they meet under the front rain porch, each sailing into a separate world, from home to work, or work from home. A wave that is forever cresting, never at rest. Awaiting his arrival like a crash, she holds the paper sack dinner at the window next to the front door. Wind picks up, cat rubs her leg, dog whimpers for a cat. So hopefully you can see how some of the spacing here makes the argument for the separation that the speaker is, or that the story is telling. And again, the image here, dog whimpers for a cat, is meant to, instead of saying they miss each other and they both want attention, the image of the dog whimpering is meant to explain that, right? I'm explaining it to you right now, so that's not really, but you get I'm trying to diagram it for you. Okay, so I'm happy to take questions if you have them now. Otherwise, we can go into some of the poems that, or the prompts that I have that I invite you to try.
Okay, so I'm gonna interrupt for just a second. We are gonna try some writing prompts. I know you're like, wait a minute, what's this participation thing? But we would encourage you and invite you to try to do some of these writing prompts. She's got a few different ones here. You could write a list poem, like the What Rises poem that she read. One only of images. It doesn't have to rhyme, correct, Katie?
Right. No.
I know that's one thing that I always get in the middle of. I always want it to rhyme, and I always get stuck on the rhyming. We have a haiku, everything's in the way. Literary archetype, which we talked about, or a paragraph of prose with images. And I actually want to share one of a book that I found recently. I was talking to Katie about this. This is a children's book. I'm just going to put it up a little bit if you can see my little itty bitty screen. But it's Words, Wit, and Wonder, Writing Your Own Poem. And this is for children. Typically, it's a children's book. I always love my children's books, so it's right up my level. But this poem, it's an acrostic poem. So an acrostic poem is usually, correct me if I'm wrong, Katie, but you start off with a word and you're trying to start each line with a letter in that word. And what the poet did in this one was use the word poetry. So P, plays with words and plants ideas. O, opens our eyes and our ears. Twirls words into riddles, ribbons, and raindrops and makes us say yes. So the Poetry. I just thought that was fun. So that's another way you could try it as well. I've been really loving the acrostic poems currently. So we are going to give you actually 10 minutes, and I will set an alarm on my end. You will not see the alarm, so no pressure on timing. But we're going to give you 10 minutes just to play with it. You can choose what type of writing prompt you want to do, but just play, have fun with it. So find a pen, paper, pencil, whatever you feel like writing with, and just try it for the next 10 minutes or so. After those 10 minutes, we'll come back and we would invite you to share if you feel comfortable sharing. If you do not, no worries, but just try out some of the things we talked about. All right, so that's about 10 minutes. I know, time goes by so quickly. I'm going to invite people, if you would like to share what you've been working on, feel free to do so.
Ellen, do you want to share?
I will try. Take into consideration, this is not my area of comfort zone. We'll put it that way. So I have been thinking a lot about red foxes lately because there's a program coming up on foxes, as we said. So I'm like, let's try an acrostic poem because it's become my new favorite right now. So, all right. So red fox was what I was working off of. Restless body moving back and forth, eyes detecting everything, darting to venture into the field, fast flying feet, occupying space and time, extinguishing light from its prey. That was my try.
That's great.
It makes me look forward to the program you have coming up soon.
Yay, that's only partially my goal.
You could use that on the flyer, right?
There you go. That's where my mind is right now. Anybody else want to share?
I vote for Sarah.
Not to put Sarah
I can share. So I was writing about, I'm working on a teacher training and I've been working on an image thinking about watersheds. And so this was sort of a list poem of things that I was thinking about including. So water flowing downhill into Lake Michigan, gravity pulling, reaching, sending, paved parking lots, water running, fast and swift, never penetrating. Michigan's land never flat, sends water cascading. Rapids and riffles, gurgling brooks, hydropower dams. Water moves, travels, journeys, clean, dirty, smelly, clear, cloudy, misty. The Great Lakes, fresh water, shark-free, blue, green, brown, black, full of algae and plants. Didn't get to finish it yet, but you know.
Hey, it's a great start. All right, well, we're about at the hour mark. Katie, do you have anything else for us this morning?
No, I appreciate you trying out some of these pieces, and I'm always telling people, pay attention. There's so many cool, crazy, arresting images out there. So I think that's a fun challenge, whether you use them in writing or not, just to sharpen your attention and keep lists of that stuff, what you notice. But otherwise, thank you for trying some of these with me, and thank you for joining the talk today.
But I think this is almost something, I feel like this is something we should be sharing with our scientists, because you're always supposed to be observing the world around you as a scientist as well. So thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate it. All right, so I think we're it for the morning. So thank you so much, Katie. Thank you everyone for joining us this morning, and go observe. So, bye everyone.